She's the teenager who killed her boyfriend and another friend by deliberately driving into a brick wall. Surveillance captured her car whizzing by like a rocket at 100 miles an hour. Today, Mackenzie Shirilla spoke through tears as she expressed remorse for the death of ex-boyfriend Dominic Russo and his friend Davion Flanagan, who was sitting in the back seat of the car.
We were all friends and Dom was my soulmate. I wish I could take all your pain away, and I'm so sorry.
It's 5:30 in the morning on July 31st, 2022. The sun hasn't even come up yet in Strongsville, Ohio. Most people are still asleep in their beds. But on Progress Road, a quiet business park street that dead ends into a brick building, something terrible is about to happen. Drop a comment and let me know where you're watching from right now, because this story will shake you no matter where you are in the world. A Toyota Camry suddenly appears on the empty street, racing toward destruction at 100 miles per hour. The engine is screaming at maximum capacity. The accelerator is pressed to the floor with such force that the car's computer shows 100% throttle application. And the driver never touches the brakes, not once. There's no skidding, no attempt to slow down, no last-second panic, just pure, calculated acceleration toward death. The car slams into the Plidco building with such devastating force that it sounds like an explosion echoing through the quiet morning air. The impact is so violent that security cameras capture the moment of destruction with crystal clarity, a moment that would later be played in court and described by a judge as evidence you can never unsee. Inside that car were 3 teenagers. 20-year-old Dominic Russo, who loved fashion and was particular about his shoes and socks from a young age. 19-year-old Davion Flanagan, a recent Strongsville High School graduate with his whole life ahead of him. Both were pronounced dead at the scene, their bodies trapped in the mangled wreckage. But 17-year-old Mackenzie Shirilla walked away from the destruction she had created. She survived the crash that she had planned, executed, and carried out with what a judge would later call precision. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't reckless driving. This wasn't a moment of teenage stupidity or a tragic mistake. This was murder executed with the cold calculation of someone who had made a choice that would destroy multiple families forever. But this calculated act of violence didn't start that morning. It started months earlier when a teenage romance turned into something much darker, much more dangerous, and ultimately deadly. This is Accused, where we dig into the cases that expose the darkest sides of human nature and reveal how ordinary people can become capable of extraordinary evil. Hit that subscribe button if you want the truth behind the headlines and the real stories that mainstream media often gets wrong. Thank you to everyone who's been following these cases and staying safe out there. Your support means everything as we continue to bring you the facts that matter. Today we're covering a case that shook Strongsville, Ohio to its core and redefined what murder can look like in the modern age. This case forced investigators, prosecutors, and an entire community to confront a terrifying reality: that a car can be just as deadly as any weapon when placed in the hands of someone with murder on their mind. We're going to show you the surveillance footage that captured every second of this calculated attack, the black box data that proved this was no accident, the pattern of escalating threats that showed premeditation, and the chilling behavior that revealed who Mackenzie Shirilla really was when she thought nobody was watching. This is the story of how a toxic teenage relationship became a double homicide disguised as a car crash, and how one girl's obsession with control led to a mission of death that she executed with terrifying precision. Mackenzie Shirilla seemed like a typical teenager from Strongsville, Ohio. At 17, she appeared to have a normal life in this quiet Cleveland suburb. She had been dating 20-year-old Dominic Russo for 3 or 4 years, a significant portion of both their young lives. For most of their relationship, she even lived in his house, essentially becoming part of his family. To the outside world, they looked like any young couple navigating the ups and downs of first love, dealing with the typical challenges that come with teenage relationships. But behind closed doors, something much more sinister was developing. This wasn't the innocent high school romance it appeared to be. Mackenzie and Dominic fought frequently, and their arguments weren't just typical teenage disagreements about who they were texting or where they were going. These were explosive confrontations that included making serious threats against each other, constant cycles of breaking up and getting back together, and an escalating pattern of psychological and emotional abuse. Prosecutors would later describe their relationship as toxic and tumultuous, with Mackenzie becoming increasingly violent and threatening in the weeks and months leading up to July 31st. She wasn't just a jealous girlfriend or a possessive teenager having normal relationship drama. She was someone whose behavior was crossing lines that should never be crossed, making threats that should never be made, and displaying a level of control and manipulation that worried the people around them. Friends and family members started to notice that Mackenzie's behavior was escalating beyond anything they had seen before. The fights were getting more intense, the threats were becoming more specific, and the pattern of breaking up and getting back together was becoming more frequent and more volatile. There were warning signs everywhere, but nobody could have predicted just how far she was willing to go to maintain control over Dominic Russo. 19-year-old Davion Flanagan was a recent Strongsville High School graduate who had the tragic misfortune of being friends with both Mackenzie and Dominic. He was an innocent bystander in their toxic relationship drama, a young man who had graduated high school and was looking forward to starting the next chapter of his life. He had no idea that getting into a car with them on that July morning would cost him everything. He trusted his friends, and that trust would ultimately lead to his death. The warning signs were escalating rapidly in the weeks and months leading up to July 31st, 2022. This wasn't a sudden snap or an impulsive decision made in a moment of anger. The evidence would later show that Mackenzie Shirilla had been building toward this moment for weeks, if not months, with a pattern of increasingly violent threats and disturbing behavior that painted a clear picture of premeditation. 2 weeks before the crash, during yet another explosive fight between Mackenzie and Dominic, she had made a threat that would later prove to be more than just angry words. While they were driving on Interstate 71, in the middle of another argument about their relationship, she threatened to crash her car with him inside it. This wasn't just an angry outburst in the heat of the moment. It was a specific, detailed threat about exactly how she would kill him if he didn't comply with her demands. It was a threat that she would later carry out with deadly precision. The relationship had become a toxic cycle of fighting, threats, breaking up, and getting back together that was taking a toll on everyone around them. Mackenzie's behavior was becoming increasingly controlling and possessive. She couldn't accept that Dominic might want to end their relationship or move on with his life. The idea that she might lose control over him was driving her to make increasingly desperate and dangerous threats. Friends and family members were growing more and more concerned about the level of hostility between the couple. There was even audio evidence that would later be presented in court of Mackenzie making threats to damage Dominic's car, showing a clear pattern of escalating aggression that was moving beyond just verbal abuse into threats of property damage and physical violence. On July 17, 2022, just 2 weeks before the fatal crash, Mackenzie made another threat during an argument with Dominic. This incident would later become crucial evidence in proving premeditation in court. The prosecution would argue that this July 17th threat showed that Mackenzie had already been planning exactly how she would end their relationship by using her car as a weapon to kill him. But the most chilling evidence of premeditation came from Mackenzie's actions in the days immediately before the crash. Judge Nancy Margaret Russo would later note that Mackenzie had chosen to drive an obscure route that she had visited just a few days before the crash, but wasn't a route she routinely took. This suggested advanced planning and reconnaissance of the location where she intended to carry out her plan. She had scouted out the perfect location for murder, a dead-end street with a solid brick building that would ensure maximum damage and minimal chance of survival. By the morning of July 31st, 2022, all the pieces were in place for what Judge Nancy Margaret Russo would later call a mission of death. Mackenzie had chosen her weapon, her Toyota Camry. She had chosen her location, Progress Road ending at the Plidco building. She had chosen her time, early morning when there would be few witnesses, and she had chosen her victims, not just Dominic, but also his innocent friend, Davion Flanagan. On July 31st, 2022, at approximately 5:30 in the morning, Mackenzie Shirilla was driving her Toyota Camry with Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan as passengers. She had deliberately chosen this early morning hour, a time when very few witnesses would be around to see what was about to happen. The streets of Strongsville were empty, the business parks were deserted, and most of the city was still asleep. It was the perfect time to commit murder without being observed. The actual crash happened at 6:15 a.m. near the intersection of Progress and Alameda Drives in northwest Strongsville. Mackenzie drove her Toyota Camry down Progress Road, a dead-end street in a business park that terminates at the Plidco building, a large brick structure that was built solid enough to stop any vehicle that might crash into it. This wasn't a route she normally took in her daily life, but it was a path she had visited just a few days before, suggesting she had been carefully planning this exact location for her attack. The car's event data recorder, also known as the black box, captured every horrifying detail of what happened in those final moments. This technology, which is now present in 99.6% of motor vehicles according to the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, records crucial data about a vehicle's operation in the seconds before and during a crash. In Mackenzie's case, that data would provide undeniable proof of her intent to kill. In the final 5 seconds before impact, Mackenzie had her accelerator pedal pressed down to 100% capacity. The throttle was also at 100%. She was demanding more power and speed from the vehicle than it was even capable of producing. The prosecution would later argue that this showed strikingly 100% acceleration through the entire final 5 seconds leading up to the crash. But perhaps even more damning was what the black box didn't record, any application of the brakes. She never applied the service brake pedal, not once, not even for a split second. The data showed that Mackenzie was in complete control of the vehicle throughout the entire sequence. There was no evidence of mechanical failure, no indication of a medical emergency, no sign that she had lost control or was trying to avoid an obstacle. The car responded exactly as she intended it to respond. When she pushed the accelerator to the floor, the car accelerated. When she steered toward the building, the car went exactly where she pointed it. She was demanding the ultimate speed and power from that Toyota Camry, and she got it. Surveillance cameras from multiple angles captured the Toyota Camry as it zoomed into view and crashed with a thunderous roar into the Plidco building. The footage would later be played multiple times in court, and Judge Nancy Margaret Russo would describe it as evidence that was chilling and tragic. The type of evidence you can never unsee because you can't forget the visuals or audio of this exhibit. When Strongsville Police Department and emergency services arrived at the scene around 45 minutes later, they found a Toyota Camry with severe damage and full airbag deployments. The front of the car was completely destroyed, crushed against the brick building that had stopped it cold. All 3 occupants were unconscious, not breathing, and trapped inside the twisted metal that had once been a car. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan were pronounced dead at the scene. The impact had been so severe that there was no possibility of survival for either passenger. They had been killed instantly by the force of the collision that Mackenzie had orchestrated. Mackenzie Shirilla was carefully extracted from the wreckage and transported to a nearby hospital for treatment of her injuries. She was the only survivor of the crash she had orchestrated, the only person who lived through the violence she had planned and executed with such precision. Question for you. If you discovered that someone you cared about was in a relationship where their partner had specifically threatened to kill them in a car crash, how would you try to intervene? Would you call the police even if your friend didn't want you to? Would you try to physically separate them? Or would you feel helpless knowing that love can make people ignore even the most dangerous warning signs? Let me know in the comments, because Davion Flanagan was just a friend caught in the middle of this toxic relationship, and his family had to live with the knowledge that he died simply because he got into the wrong car with the wrong people on the wrong morning. When Strongsville Police Department and emergency services arrived at the scene on Progress Road, they immediately began what would become one of the most thorough and technologically advanced investigations in the department's history. The first priority was obviously emergency medical care for the victims, but once it became clear that 2 of the 3 occupants were deceased, the focus shifted to determining exactly what had happened and why. The crash reconstruction would reveal shocking truths about what had really happened on Progress Road. Mark Sargent, a certified forensic mechanic expert from fire and explosions consultants, was brought in to conduct a detailed examination of the heavily damaged Toyota Camry and its event data recorder. His analysis would provide the technical evidence that would prove this was not an accident, but a deliberate act of murder. Sargent's investigation revealed that Mackenzie had her right foot pressed down on the acceleration pedal to its full extent throughout the final approach to the building. The throttle was also at maximum capacity. Most importantly for the case, the service brake pedal was never applied before impact, not even for a fraction of a second. The vehicle itself had no mechanical defects that could have contributed to the crash. There was no brake failure, no steering problems, no accelerator malfunction. The car performed exactly as Mackenzie intended it to perform. The surveillance footage would become the backbone of the prosecution's case, providing visual evidence that supported the technical data from the black box. Multiple cameras from different angles captured the Toyota Camry as it appeared in view and crashed into the building with devastating force. The footage showed a vehicle under complete control, traveling in a straight line directly toward the building with no deviation, no swerving, no apparent attempt to avoid the collision. Judge Nancy Margaret Russo would later say about this footage, "This is the type of evidence you can never unsee. You can't forget the visuals or audio of this exhibit. It is chilling and tragic." The combination of the visual evidence and the technical data created an undeniable picture of intentional murder rather than accidental death. But investigators found even more damning evidence during their search of the vehicle and Mackenzie's belongings. Hidden in the car, they discovered psilocybin mushrooms and a digital scale in her possession. This discovery would add drug possession and possession of criminal tools charges to the growing list of crimes she would face. The presence of these illegal drugs raised additional questions about her state of mind and her activities leading up to the crash. The investigation team also worked to uncover the pattern of threats and violent behavior that had been escalating in the weeks and months before the crash. They found the audio recording that Dominic had made of Mackenzie threatening him, degrading him, and damaging his property during a fight in July 2022. This recording would become crucial evidence showing her capacity for violence and her willingness to carry out threats against Dominic. They also documented the July 17th incident, where she had threatened to crash the car with Dominic inside during an argument on Interstate 71. This threat, made just 2 weeks before she actually carried it out, would become key evidence of premeditation. It showed that this wasn't a spontaneous act of violence, but something she had been planning and threatening to do for weeks. Investigators also looked into Mackenzie's activities in the days immediately before the crash. They discovered that she had visited the Progress Road location just a few days before July 31st, even though it wasn't a route she normally traveled. This suggested reconnaissance and planning, further supporting the theory that this was a premeditated murder rather than an impulsive act or tragic accident. The digital evidence painted a picture of premeditation that went far beyond a moment of anger or reckless driving. Every piece of technical evidence, every threat she had made, every planning step she had taken, all pointed to the same conclusion. Mackenzie Shirilla had deliberately chosen to use her car as a weapon to commit murder, and she had executed that plan with deadly precision. Mackenzie Shirilla was transported to a nearby hospital and treated for her injuries following the crash. While she had survived the impact, she had sustained significant injuries that required medical attention. But it was her behavior during her recovery, and in the days and weeks that followed, that would prove to be just as damning as the physical evidence from the crash scene. Her complete lack of remorse and her shocking priorities would horrify investigators, prosecutors, and ultimately the judge who would sentence her. When police finally arrested Mackenzie, body cam footage captured a moment that would define how investigators, prosecutors, and the public would see her character for the rest of the case. As an officer was in the process of switching her handcuffs during the arrest procedure, Mackenzie's primary concern wasn't the two people she had killed, wasn't the families she had destroyed, wasn't the lives she had ended. It was her jewelry. "Could you please be careful taking this one off so it doesn't break the bracelet, please?" she asked the officer in a voice that showed more concern for her accessories than for the victims of her crime. She was wearing at least 6 bracelets at the time, and the officer actually complied with her request, being as gentle as possible while arresting her for double murder. The contrast was stark. Here was a girl who had just been charged with intentionally killing 2 people, and her biggest worry was whether her bracelet would get damaged during the arrest process. This moment of footage would later be shown in court and analyzed by legal experts as evidence of her lack of empathy and remorse. The fact that she could be more concerned about jewelry than about the deaths she had caused revealed a level of callousness that shocked even experienced law enforcement officers who had seen their share of violent criminals.
But the shocking lack of remorse didn't end with the arrest. The evidence of her priorities and her attitude in the weeks and months following the crash would become a central part of the prosecution's case against her. During Mackenzie's weeks-long hospitalization following the crash, investigators discovered that she and her mother were actually seeking employment with a Los Angeles-based modeling agency, while the families of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan were planning funerals and grieving the loss of their loved ones. Mackenzie was apparently thinking about launching a modeling career and capitalizing on whatever attention the case might bring her. Even more disturbing, months after the crash, and before she was formally charged with murder, Mackenzie could be seen on social media posts celebrating Halloween and attending a concert in Cleveland's Flats district. These weren't private moments of trying to maintain normalcy during a difficult time. These were public social media posts that showed her actively celebrating and having fun while the families of her victims were still processing their grief. Prosecutors would later present TikTok videos and other social media evidence showing Mackenzie at a concert in a wheelchair and celebrating Halloween after the crash. The images showed someone who appeared to be enjoying herself and living her life as if nothing had happened, as if she hadn't just killed 2 people in a calculated act of violence. At her eventual sentencing hearing, prosecutors would point out that soon after the high-speed crash that killed 2 people, Mackenzie had asked authorities if they could just suspend her license for 10 years, rather than face serious criminal charges. This request showed what prosecutors called her shocking lack of remorse and her complete failure to understand the gravity of what she had done. The idea that someone could kill 2 people and then ask for just a license suspension revealed a mindset that was completely disconnected from the reality of her crimes. Judge Nancy Margaret Russo would later comment on this behavior, saying, "It's hard to fathom how someone could be concerned over their driving privileges having just caused the deaths of 2 people." The judge's words captured what many people felt when they learned about Mackenzie's priorities and her behavior in the aftermath of the murders. On August 14, 2023, more than a year after the crash, Mackenzie Shirilla was formally charged with 12 counts, including 4 counts of murder, 4 counts of felonious assault, 2 counts of aggravated vehicular homicide, 1 count of drug possession, and 1 count of possessing criminal tools. The charges reflected the severity of her crimes and the overwhelming evidence that had been gathered against her. Mackenzie Shirilla's trial began on August 7, 2023, before Cuyahoga County Common Pleas Judge Nancy Margaret Russo in a bench trial. Mackenzie had made the strategic decision to waive her right to a jury trial, meaning that the judge alone would review the evidence and decide her fate. This decision put enormous pressure on both the prosecution and the defense to present their cases clearly and convincingly to a single person who would determine whether Mackenzie would spend the rest of her life in prison.
The courtroom was packed to capacity every day of the trial, with some people who came to hear the proceedings not even allowed inside due to the overwhelming public interest in the case. The case had captured the attention of the entire Cleveland area and beyond, as people struggled to understand how a teenager could commit such a calculated act of violence against people she claimed to love. The prosecution's case was devastating in its thoroughness and technical precision. Led by prosecutor Tim Troop from the Cuyahoga County Prosecutor's Office, the state methodically presented evidence that painted a clear picture of premeditated murder. They played the surveillance footage of the crash multiple times, showing the court exactly how Mackenzie's vehicle appeared and crashed into the building with tremendous force. Each viewing of the footage seemed to make the intentional nature of the crash more obvious and more horrifying. The prosecution also presented autopsy photos of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan, bringing many in the courtroom to tears as they were forced to confront the reality of what violence looks like when a car becomes a weapon. Even Dominic's mother had to leave the courtroom during this portion of the testimony, unable to bear seeing the evidence of what had been done to her son. The technical evidence presented by the prosecution was overwhelming. Mark Sargent, the certified forensic mechanic expert, testified about his examination of the heavily damaged Toyota Camry and its event data recorder. He explained to the court in detail how the black box data showed that moments before the crash, the accelerator pedal was being pushed down at 100% capacity with no application of the brake. He testified that Mackenzie was demanding more power and speed from the vehicle than it was capable of producing, and that there was no evidence of any attempt to slow down or avoid the collision. Prosecutor Tim Troop argued that the evidence clearly showed Mackenzie had been in a turbulent and increasingly violent relationship with Dominic and had made specific threats in the past about using her car as a weapon. There is no doubt that this happened because of the relationship with Dominic, and the defendant's intent was clearly to end that, and she took everybody that was in the car with her, he told the court. The prosecution also presented evidence of the escalating pattern of threats and violence leading up to July 31st. They played the audio recording of Mackenzie threatening Dominic, degrading him, and damaging his property during one of their fights. They presented testimony about the July 17th incident, where she had threatened to crash the car with Dominic inside during an argument on Interstate 71. This evidence showed that the crash wasn't an impulsive act, but the culmination of weeks or months of planning and threatening. The prosecution's closing argument focused heavily on the technical evidence that proved intent beyond any reasonable doubt. Accelerator pedal percentages displayed 100% application, with throttle percentages also peaking at 100%. No driver inputted brake application was observed during any of the events associated with the collision, offering evidence that the driver was demanding more power and speed from the vehicle than it was able to produce, the prosecution demonstrated to the judge. They also emphasized Mackenzie's behavior after the crash as evidence of her lack of remorse and her true character. They showed the court social media evidence of her attending concerts and celebrating holidays, while the families of her victims were still grieving. They presented evidence of her concerns about her bracelet during her arrest and her request for just a license suspension rather than serious criminal charges. Defense attorney James McDonnell faced an almost impossible task in trying to defend his client against such overwhelming evidence. He attempted to argue that many things could have caused the accident, suggesting possibilities like accelerator misapplication, where someone in a panic might step on the gas pedal when they meant to hit the brake. He suggested that maybe Mackenzie had been trying to avoid something on the road, or that a passenger could have grabbed the steering wheel, or that she could have been trying to regain control of the vehicle. We are really never going to know what happened in that car, much less prove by evidence beyond a reasonable doubt that she purposely drove that car, McDonnell argued to Judge Russo. Purposely, it has to be established that at the time in question, there was present in the mind of Mackenzie a specific intent to cause the death of her boyfriend, Dominic Russo, and her friend, Davion Flanagan. McDonnell also tried to argue that Mackenzie's admission of responsibility to medical professionals after the crash was just her feeling terrible about what had happened, not an admission of intentional murder. She's not saying she committed aggravated murder, he asserted, but the defense's arguments were overwhelmed by the mountain of evidence presented by the prosecution. The technical data from the black box, the surveillance footage, the pattern of threats and escalating violence, and Mackenzie's behavior after the crash all pointed to the same conclusion. On August 14, 2023, Judge Nancy Margaret Russo announced her verdict: guilty on all 12 counts, including 4 counts of murder. The judge's words were damning and would be quoted in news reports around the country. This was not reckless driving. This was murder. Judge Russo went on to deliver some of the most memorable and chilling language ever used in a murder case. She morphs from a responsible driver to literal hell on wheels as she makes her way down the street. She had a mission, and she executed it with precision. The phrase hell on wheels would become synonymous with Mackenzie Shirilla and would define how the public remembered her case. The judge noted that Mackenzie had deliberately chosen to drive at 5:30 a.m., an hour when not many witnesses would be around, along a path she didn't routinely use but had visited a few days before. She had a mission, and she executed it with precision. The mission was death. Judge Russo also emphasized the technical evidence that proved intentionality. Mackenzie alone decided to push the pedal to the floor and demand the ultimate speed of that vehicle to 100 miles per hour. The judge made it clear that this wasn't an accident, wasn't reckless driving, and wasn't a moment of poor judgment. It was calculated, premeditated murder carried out with precision and forethought. On August 21, 2023, Mackenzie Shirilla returned to court for her sentencing hearing, where she would learn how much of her life she would spend behind bars for the murders of Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. The families of both victims were present in the courtroom, preparing to hear victim impact statements and to see justice served for their loved ones. Before the sentencing, family members of both victims spoke to the court about the impact of Mackenzie's crimes on their lives. Davion Flanagan's sister, Davion Flanagan, told the court, "I feel stuck. I feel like I can't move forward. I feel lost. I would like you to give Mackenzie the longest possible sentence. I've known her for about 3 years, and she's always taking the easy way out." The prosecution presented additional evidence of Mackenzie's lack of remorse, including TikTok videos showing her at a concert and celebrating Halloween after the crash. Her behavior in the months following the murders continued to shock those following the case. When Mackenzie's mother tried to minimize the importance of Davion Flanagan's life during her statement to the court, calling him just a new friend, Judge Russo immediately challenged her, asking, "What does that mean? His life was worthless." The mother quickly walked back her comment and apologized to the victims' families. Judge Nancy Margaret Russo then sentenced Mackenzie Shirilla to 2 concurrent sentences of 15 years to life in prison. The judge explained her decision to give concurrent rather than consecutive sentences. I understand that the pain in this room wants me to impose the harshest sentence, but I don't believe that would be the appropriate sentence, because I do believe that Mackenzie won't be out in 15 years. Additionally, her driver's license was suspended for life, ensuring that she would never be able to legally operate a motor vehicle again. Before sentencing, Mackenzie finally spoke to the court in what many saw as too little, too late. The families of Dominic and Davion, I'm so deeply sorry. I would never let this happen or do it on purpose. We are all friends, and Dom was my soulmate. I wish I could take all your pain away. I'm so sorry. But the judge and many observers found these words hollow, given all the evidence of premeditation and her behavior after the crash. The case didn't end with the sentencing. Mackenzie's defense team filed appeals, arguing that the conviction should be overturned and that she should receive a new trial. They argued that the evidence was insufficient to prove murder and that the judge had made errors in her interpretation of the law and the evidence. On September 26, 2024, the 8th District Court of Appeals comprehensively rejected all of Mackenzie's appeals arguments and upheld her conviction. The appeals court's decision was thorough and definitive. The defendant's convictions for murder and felonious assault were supported by sufficient evidence and were not against the manifest weight of the evidence. The appeals court specifically addressed the evidence that had convinced the trial court of Mackenzie's guilt. The defendant had previously threatened to crash her car with her boyfriend inside during a fight. The defendant then did crash her car into a wall, killing the boyfriend and another passenger. A mechanical inspection revealed no latent mechanical defects that could have caused the crash. A medical examination of the defendant after the crash revealed no significant physical or mental abnormalities that would be indicative of a seizure or other neurological event. Data from the vehicle's computer revealed that the accelerator was depressed to 100% and that the driver had not once hit the brake before hitting the wall. The appeals court concluded, after reviewing the entire record, this was not the exceptional case where the evidence weighed heavily against conviction. The decision meant that Mackenzie's conviction was final and that she would serve her full sentence without the possibility of appeal to higher courts. As of 2025, Mackenzie Shirilla is serving her sentence at the Ohio Reformatory for Women, where she will remain for at least the next decade. Her parole eligibility date is October 21st, 2037, and her next parole hearing is scheduled for September 2037. She will be 35 years old before she can even be considered for release, and there is no guarantee that she will be granted parole when that time comes. Today, there are memorials for 20-year-old Dominic Russo and 19-year-old Davion Flanagan in Strongsville, Ohio. Two young men who should have had decades of life ahead of them, who should have had the chance to fall in love, get married, have children, and build lives of their own. Instead, they became statistics in a case that shocked an entire community and redefined how we think about domestic violence and murder. Dominic's sister Christina described him as a lover of fashion who was particular about his shoes and socks from a young age, and a doting uncle who adored his nieces and nephews. In every picture, he's hugging and kissing the kids. He loved them so much, she said. He's already so missed. I would do anything to bring him back, really. It all sucks really bad. It's really, really tough. But perhaps the most heartbreaking part of this entire case is what Dominic's father, Frank Russo, said when asked about Mackenzie's sentence. It's horrible for everybody. Yeah, I lost my son. It's harder on our family, but I don't want the rest of her life ruined too. It isn't going to make me feel any better. Even in his grief, even after losing his son to such a calculated act of violence, he found compassion for the girl who killed him. That level of forgiveness and humanity in the face of such loss is almost impossible to comprehend. This case forces us to confront uncomfortable questions about love, control, and violence. What drives someone to choose murder over simply walking away from a relationship? How does a teenage romance become so toxic that one person decides the only solution is to kill Judge Nancy Margaret Russo called it hard to fathom how someone could be concerned over their driving privileges having just caused the deaths of 2 people. But the reality is that Mackenzie Shirilla's mindset may never be fully understood. What we do know is that Mackenzie Shirilla turned a teenage relationship dispute into a calculated double homicide, proving that domestic violence can take forms we never expect, and that cars can be just as deadly as any weapon when placed in the hands of someone with murder on their mind. She showed us that age doesn't protect us from evil, that youth doesn't excuse calculated violence, and that sometimes the people we trust most are the ones most capable of destroying us. Tomorrow, we're covering another case where love turned deadly, but in a completely different way, a case that will show you how obsession can drive people to lengths you never thought possible. If cases like this matter to you, if you believe in holding people accountable for their actions, no matter how young they are or how much they claim to love their victims, subscribe to Accused. Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan deserve to grow up, to fall in love, to have families of their own, to make mistakes and learn from them, to experience all the joys and challenges that life has to offer. Instead, they became victims of someone who decided that if she couldn't control her relationship, she would destroy it completely, taking innocent lives with her. The Mackenzie Shirilla case reminds us that evil doesn't always look like what we expect. It can look like a teenage girl worried about her bracelet during an arrest for double murder. It can look like someone attending concerts and celebrating holidays while families grieve. It can look like a person who claims love while planning death. Love shouldn't be a death sentence, but for Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan, that's exactly what it became. Their deaths weren't just a tragedy. They were a warning. A warning about the signs of escalating domestic violence, about the importance of taking threats seriously, and about the reality that cars can be weapons in the hands of someone determined to kill. Judge Nancy Margaret Russo was right when she said Mackenzie Shirilla had a mission and executed it with precision. That mission cost 2 young men their lives and changed countless others forever. Rest in peace, Dominic Russo and Davion Flanagan. Your lives mattered. Your deaths weren't in vain if they help others recognize the warning signs, and your memories deserve better than being footnotes in someone else's story of violence and control.